So this one time I'm staying at my grandpa's house, and he had VHS recorded The Karate Kid off of TV or something. I think I've told you a little bit about this scenario before, but it fits here as well. And so I'm sitting there, I'm watching The Karate Kid. It's the first time I've ever seen it. Of course, I'm relating to the point of view character, Daniel LaRusso. Of course, I can't stand Johnny Lawrence. I have many people in my life at that point who are analogous to me, with Johnny Lawrence, the typical 80s bully, blonde hair, making my life miserable. So I'm watching the thing and I'm really into it, and my grandpa is watching me watch it. And I get to the end of the show, and Grandpa's like, "Hey, what do you think about when you watch a show like that?" And we talked for a long time, and clearly what he was trying to get me to do was to think about levels of application for my own character, for my own life. It was a great grandparenting moment on his part. Discipline, hard work, how to respond to bullying, character, being teachable, interacting with a mentor, whatever it is that he wanted me to think about. What he was trying to put in my head was this idea that there is some level of application there. But at the same time, it's Karate Kid. It's very open-ended. You could interpret that 11 gazillion different ways and run off in this direction or that direction with it. Likewise, in the kingdom parables of Matthew chapter 13, the personal application part is a little more open-ended than the description of the kingdom part. Let me take another run at that. I maybe made that sound a little bit confusing. What Jesus is trying to do in Matthew chapter 13 is explain how the kingdom is. It's the same thing that he was doing in Matthew 5 through 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, except in the Sermon on the Mount, he's explaining it overtly, through overt theological, through the front door language. Here he's using story and narrative to illustrate what the kingdom is about. And I think the result is that when we go and look at something like, again, say the Sermon on the Mount, we see stuff like love your enemy. Well, that's pretty applicable. Like either you love your enemy or you don't. It's pretty easy. The only hard part is like, how do you do it? What would it look like to show love to your enemy? Turn the other cheek. Well, okay, either you're doing that or you're not doing that. Don't hate someone in your heart. Well, either you're doing that or you're not doing that. It's not too hard to understand what the application is when Jesus says, don't worry about these things, because if you're part of the kingdom, you know that there's a God who's God of the kingdom and he's got everything under control. It's also through the front door. But the parables, you see a lot more deviation in terms of how different teachers and preachers will communicate what to do with it for yourself. Now, the stuff about how the kingdom is, again, is pretty overt. In the first parable that we've looked at here, there's one about the sower. You got 4 different types of soil. The seed goes onto all the different types of soil. And then Jesus overtly explains what the first 3 failed types of soil mean and why they don't work out. And by saying only one of the 4 types of soil is going to work out, he's lowering expectations and saying, look, the kingdom is not going to steamroll planet Earth right now. In this moment of how the kingdom is going to happen, you're going to see this message, you're going to see this truth go out and not be well received by perhaps a majority of humans, but certainly by a majority of archetypes, of templates of how the human heart is. So if you want to know what Jesus is trying to communicate about the nature of the kingdom in the meta sense, no problem. It's in red letters. It's in your Bible from verses, whatever I said it was, 18 through 23. But if you want a crystal clear smoking gun application for this, same way you get it in maybe other teachings of Jesus, it's going to be a little bit trickier. If you just need to hear one, you can go on the internet and throw a rock in any direction, and there will be a take on what you need to be doing with this passage. The most common take that I hear, and I'm just going to tell you up front, I think this one is a little bit problematic, is the idea that you are one of the 4 types of soil, that you have control over which of the 4 types of soil you are, and that all of your behavior, usually in a somewhat fundamentalist, extra-biblical framework, that all of your behavior inches you toward one of these 4 types of soil. It's like every day you've got 15 shiny little stones. Again, I don't think this, I just hear people say this a lot. And you got these 15 shiny stones, and you can only distribute them to one of these 4 types of soil bowls labeled in front of you each day. And so maybe you play video games a little too much, and someone in one of those video games was dressed a little bit inappropriately. Well, you're going to have to then take one of those stones and drop that in the hardened heart path where the evil one comes and snatches away what God wants to do in your life bowl. Maybe you spend too much time managing your 401k on a given day or looking at your investment portfolio and clank, there goes another one of those stones into a bowl, and this time it's the one where all the weeds and everything come and choke everything out. Maybe you get ready to go to bed and you've got 2 books on your nightstand, and one is Stephen King's It, and the other one is the Bible, and you decide that tonight you're just going to read a couple verses from the Bible, but a whole bunch of chapters from It. You just dropped another stone, which sounds curiously like a coin, into another bowl, but this time it was into the one with really shallow roots. But maybe you get done reading Stephen King's It, and you go upstairs for midnight snack, and you stub your toe, and instead of swearing, you're like, nuts! Well, that's a stone in the jar of good soil. And then you go up there and you're like, maybe I should listen to some heavy metal music or some rapsters. But then instead you're like, no, I'm going to listen to some worship music. And in doing so, you put another one of your smooth stones into the jar of have a better heart. And if you move your stones around enough, you can get your heart to the right place where the seed will land on it and things will work out. Okay, again, I don't think any of that. And I think the most obvious weakness of that position is that it's anachronistic. In the parable, all of these soils are just sitting there. It's just how they are. They're not doing anything. It's just, this is the part that looks to be predetermined by nature or fate or whatever. It's just soil. It's there. Somebody put a path there one time. I don't know. Birds eat there one time. I don't know how that happened. It's just what it is. And then the seed takes root and it grows up into something. Well, the seed that takes root with the values of the kingdom is what would even prompt you to care about where you put these hypothetical stones into different jars and to nurture your heart toward being the fertile soil. And so I say it's anachronistic because clearly this kingdom parable about the sower is not one that is about the devotional life. It's not one that is about being a better follower of Jesus. It is one that is about the front end of faith and the acceptance or rejection of the thing. So often you will hear, what kind of soil do you want to be? How are you going to prepare your heart to be the right kind of soil? And the thing about it is, that's a really nice, really useful message that just doesn't have anything to do with this parable. It's completely fine for us to sit around and think like, you know what? Am I doing things that are hardening or damaging to my heart? Am I doing things that make me see other people in a dark light? Am I doing things that put distance between me and the character and nature of God? Am I doing things that cloud my judgment and my mindset? Am I doing things that are nothing but investments in myself, selfishly? Do I put things into me all the time that give me a bleaker, darker outlook on things? Or do I look for things that are redemptive and try to engage with culture and life in a way that is redemptive? Those are all brilliantly important questions to be asking, and we don't need this parable to mean that in order to come away from the Gospel of Matthew saying those are questions we should ask. At least as it pertains to the theological life moment being described in the parable of the sower, you don't have any control over what kind of soil you are. You just are where you are. You might look at that and be like, well, that's not fair. So 3 of the 4 types don't get to go to heaven or be Christians? Well, I don't know. It doesn't necessarily say that. It just says that the 4th soil is the one that reproduces itself, that grows all the way up into health and takes that data packet in the seed of the values of the kingdom and duplicates those values of the kingdom repeatedly. Jesus' criticism, for example, of the progress of the seed that fell on the 3rd type of soil is that it is ultimately unfruitful. It doesn't say there's no plant. It doesn't really speak to what God does with that metaphorical person in terms of eternity or judgment or after the fact. But again, here there's a definite judgment from Jesus as to the effectiveness of that 3rd type of soil versus the wildly effective 4th type of soil. So if there is one obvious application here, I think it only falls into this 4th type of soil. I don't get the impression from the text that we get to decide what type of soil we are. God might do things, soil might mean different things. This is a meta example to describe the unfolding of the kingdom, not even so much you as an individual. It's a bigger picture thing. But maybe when we get down to that 4th type of soil, there is something to draw from this, and that is to be constantly evaluating, If you think there's a God, if you think Jesus is his son, if you think there is a kingdom, if you think the kingdom values are the truest, realest thing, then your life as that kingdom plant grows up should be giving away what you've received. It should be duplicating itself a lot more than once. And if this parable on an application level prompts us to evaluate that, I think that would be in keeping with the meaning and the clear intent of the parable on a personal level. But what's the central application or takeaway for you and me from the parable of the sower? I think is simply this. Y'all probably thought the kingdom was this way, and you were mistaken in how that's going to unfold and what your expectations were. It turns out it's actually this other way over here. You used to think this thing, now you should think this thing. You might have been expecting this thing, but there's a twist. You should be expecting this thing. As we move on in Matthew 13, I think we run into a couple of kingdom parables that zero in a little bit more on your heart, my actions, my response, your response. But I think this parable of the sower happens on the front end because it frames the whole discussion in a meta way before we pull in tighter to what you and I do. Could I be wrong? Oh my goodness, yes! I could be completely wrong. Is it possible that the people who I just said are maybe misguided in how they're teaching this are the ones who actually make sense and are getting it right? Yep, they sure could be. I've made a case. I got a way that I read it and a thing that makes sense to me. Somebody who reads it differently is not the bad guy, and they're not even necessarily the one that's getting it wrong. What we've talked about today is what I see in the text, and it's an important thing for me to disclose so that you can factor that into your mental equation as we work through the rest of Matthew chapter 13, and then you'll know where I'm coming from in terms of how do you apply to the individual, the parable of the sower, and you can take that into account and run that in your mental equation so that you can land ultimately wherever you need to land on this stuff, because you are you, it's the internet, and I didn't write the Bible and I'm not in charge of it. But it is fun to wrestle it through together, isn't it? We're on to my favorite parable of Jesus next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. I appreciate you so much. Let's do this again soon.